Welcome back to the realm of history. Today we're looking at how World War I officially came to a close with the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference. So that's where we will begin. It all starts on January 18th, 1919. There was a conference held to basically establish the terms of peace post World War I. It was held at the Palace of Versailles, which, as you probably know if you've been following some of my other lessons, is located just outside of Paris. Now, there were delegates sent from 32 countries, and overall, it went into some debate, some discussion, lasting about 1 year in total. Now, one of the key things to know is that although there were 32 total delegates or countries represented here, really the big decisions were made by the Big Four. Now, the Big Four are the key figures Woodrow Wilson from the United States, George Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. Now, notice that you do not see Russia or Germany listed here. The reason is, of course, Germany was taking the blame for the war. They were not represented. Russia was actually fighting the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Revolution. So they had civil war to deal with back on the home front. So they were not in a place to meet and discuss the situation of peace. We're going to talk about Woodrow Wilson a bit and his 14 points. The 14 points basically are a plan put together by Woodrow Wilson aiming to achieve a just and lasting peace. The basic idea of many of his points is centered on the issue of self-determination. He believed that people should be able to decide for themselves what government they wish to live under. And this was primarily focusing on the many independent countries that came out, or the newly founded countries that came out of the Paris Peace Conference post World War I. So what his argument was is that he was trying to avoid future revolutions by allowing the people in certain ethnic groups and certain national regions to decide their own form of government. And then it went a little bit farther. His 14th point was one that was really important. It was the proposal of a general association of nations that would basically protect great and small nations alike. This sounds a lot like today's United Nations or something that we might think of in the United States as NATO. But really, it was called the League of Nations back then. It was the precedent for the League of Nations. Next is capital letter C. Out of the Paris Peace Conference, the key ideology is the Treaty of Versailles. So after we took a look at Wilson's ideas and how he wanted to have peace and avoid future revolutions, Great Britain, and the French were a little bit apprehensive to accept Wilson's ideas of peaceful suggestions. They were really more concerned with national security due to the fact that, hey, the war had been fought on European soil, and especially for France being right there on the border of Germany, this was something that they needed to think about. They wanted to seriously limit Germany of its military power, and this is what came out of the Treaty of Versailles. It's an agreement between the Allied powers and Germany, and it was signed on June 28th, 1919. That was 5 years from the day that Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia to really kick off World War I, or what was known as the Great War back then. The League of Nations was adopted into the treaty, and that was Wilson's 14th point. It was put into the treaty as an international association to keep peace. One of the big things that you can take a look at in understanding the Treaty of Versailles is why it was a flawed peace. And one of the things that you really need to take a look at here is how it did punish Germany. And the treaty took a lot of power away from Germany. Germany lost substantial territory in both Europe and also in Africa and Asia. And it did have severe restrictions placed on its military power. There was a cap of how many troops they could have. There was the disbandment of their air force. And also, they were no longer allowed to purchase or create submarines. It also placed the sole responsibility for the war on Germany. Didn't Austria-Hungary declare war first? Yes, but it's fairly known that Germany really propagated the war. I mean, they were really pushing hard during this whole engagement. This was outlined in the treaty, and there's a part of the treaty called the War Guilt Clause that specifically provides responsibility on the shoulders of Germany. Therefore, and because of this, Germany had to pay what are called reparations to the Allies. Reparations are money or payments that a defeated nation is required to pay to compensate for damage or injury during a war to basically the winning party or parties. The League of Nations took over all of Germany's territories in Africa and the Pacific. So there were some pretty harsh punishments on Germany, which led to a lot of anger and bitterness toward the Allies. Next, we'll start breaking down why this was such a troubled treaty. A lot of it is going to be based off of the fact that there were the creation of new nations. Now, there's a map on page 860 that I'd like to show you real quick. So there's kind of a before and after here. This is basically Europe prior to World War I. You can see the amount of territory that Germany controls. You can see that Russia comes out all the way to the border of Germany where modern day Poland is, and they also controlled all of this stretch of land along the Baltic Sea. You can see that France's borders are here, and that the Ottoman Empire is also in this region up into the Balkans as well. So that's going to change. Okay, you're going to see that the map is going to swivel here. Germany looks a little smaller. You've got some new countries like Czechoslovakia. Austria and Hungary are now separated. What was once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Yugoslavia, is now an independent country. You've got Romania. You've got Poland on the map now. And then Russia was forced to give up a lot of territory here, like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland all became once again independent countries. And so those are some of the big changes that came out of the Treaty of Versailles and the new areas that were created. Once again, to take a look at that list, well, we're going to take you through here. Austria-Hungary divided up into 4 independent countries. That's Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire was cut down to basically encompassing only modern-day Turkey. Some of their lands in the Middle East went to the British and the French, like the British took Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. The French controlled Syria and Lebanon for a short time. Russia, as I said, they lost some land, like what is modern-day Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all became independent nations. And then the new nations of Poland and Romania were also created out of this. Now, some of the big picture problems that you really want to make sure that you understand. First of all, we know that World War II happened within the next 20 to 30 years, so that the treaty did not establish long-lasting peace. The United States eventually rejected the treaty entirely, and the Americans objected to President Wilson's League of Nations. The United States did not sign in on this and did not join the League of Nations. In fact, they created their own treaty with Germany several years later and restructured doing something called the Dawes Plan, the German repayment. Germany, because of the war guilt clause, like I said earlier, had a great deal of bitterness toward the Allies. Japan and Italy were also angered because they felt like they provided support to the Allies and they didn't get any land, they didn't get much of anything at all. And the League of Nations really didn't have such a great showing in some of the early mandated necessities that they were involved in. There is a chart that talks about all of these different provisions that I've been covering today, and that is on page 861. Here's that chart. It basically talks about how the League of Nations was formed. It talks about those territorial losses, the military restrictions. I want to talk about that. It limited the size of the German army and prohibited from importing or manufacturing weapons or war material. Also forbidden to build or buy submarines or even have an air force at all. So the military restrictions were pretty severe. And then there's the war guilt clause. Germany was forced to pay the Allies $33 billion in reparations over 30 years. The key idea here that you want to take from this lesson is you want to be able to write your exit slip. You want to be able to explain why the Treaty of Versailles was problematic, what it may lead to in the future, and why it is known as a flawed peace. Thank you.